It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the Gigabyte AORUS AD27QD. As usual, this video accompanies a more detailed written review, and you can find a link to that in the description of the video alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. As usual, remember that this video does not represent exactly what the monitor will look like firsthand. What you see on the video depends on my camera, it depends on the processing done by my video editing software, by YouTube, and ultimately the screen that you're actually viewing the video on. This monitor uses a 27-inch IPS type panel, one from Innolux, and this has a 2560 by 1440 resolution and a 144Hz refresh rate. So the panel is a bit different to what most of the other competing models use, and they use an AU Optronics AHVA panel. This resolution delivers a nice pixel density, so images, games, suitably high resolution content looks quite nice and crisp. It's not super high by modern standards, not UHD of this kind of size or anything like that, but it certainly is a nice upgrade from Full HD on a monitor of this kind of size, or even a bit smaller. It also gives you a useful amount of desktop real estate, so lots of useful work area to play with or to work with if you prefer. I always like to comment on the screen surface as well quite early on in my videos. This is because it's something I see as very important. It's certainly important to some users because a grainy screen surface bothers some users, and indeed having a nice light screen surface with a smooth texture can improve the perceived clarity and vibrancy of the image. So it's really very important, and it's something that many reviewers just gloss over, no pun intended. This monitor uses a light matte anti-glare screen surface, and this has quite a smooth finish to the screen, so it doesn't have an overly grainy look when you're observing lighter shades. It actually looks quite smooth. There's a sort of a little bit of a graininess if you look carefully, but this is really quite slight and it's not something that most users are going to notice. So the overall clarity and vibrancy is preserved nicely. I'm going to talk about the external features of the monitor. So the monitor has quite an angular look to it. It actually reminds me of some of the more recent Acer Predator models. It has a sort of penguin foot design, but it's quite angular, has lots of sharp angles. And the central AORUS logo, it's shiny silver. I don't find it distracting, I don't really notice it when I'm just using the monitor normally. It's got a little power LED beneath that, and there's a joystick at the bottom which controls the OSD. So the power light and the OSD menu system are explored in the OSD video. The bottom bezel is moderately thick, and that's matte black plastic, but the bottom and side bezels have a dual stage bezel design. So they have a very thin hard outer component, or a slender hard outer component. When I say very thin, I don't mean it's fragile or anything like that. It's just a common design used by monitors now, with the so-called three-side borderless design. So when the monitor's switched off, as it is now, you can see the panel border blends in quite nicely. There is a very thin panel border, and when the monitor's switched on, you can see that around the image. And then there's a slender hard outer component of plastic outside of that. The screen surface is light matte anti-glare, so that offers good glare handling whilst retaining a good level of clarity and vibrancy to the image. You can see some sort of soft reflections if you're at a sharp angle and you're in a bright room like I am now, but it doesn't have that kind of mirror-like look that a glossy monitor has in terms of the reflections, so it certainly offers better glare handling than that. The stand offers good ergonomic flexibility, so you can adjust the height of the monitor, you can swivel it left and right. You can also tilt the screen backwards and forwards a little bit, and you can rotate the monitor clockwise into portrait. At the side, the monitor is reasonably slender, at least the screen itself is at the thinnest point, but it lumps out centrally where the robust stand attaches. So I showed you the ergonomic flexibility. It's also a robust design, has powder coated metal at the bottom, so it's got a good weight to the base section of it, and the neck itself is quite thick, and the adjustments are nice and smooth. I didn't have any issue adjusting the monitor, which is why I was able to show you the adjustability just with one hand. There isn't anything more really to note from the side, except that there is a glossy black region here. There's one on the other side as well, and that actually has part of the RGB LED lighting feature, and that's explored in the OSD video. There's also further aspects of that lighting feature to note from the rear, which I'll go through shortly. At the rear of the monitor, it's mainly matte black plastic, but there are some glossy elements. Those glossy elements are again related to the RGB lighting feature. You can't really see them when the monitor's off, but when the feature is enabled, as I show you in the OSD video, and certainly when the room is darker, you can see them. There's also a little central Aorus Falcon logo there, which also lights up as part of the RGB lighting feature. And that can be controlled using software if you've got the USB cable connected and you've got the appropriate software installed. I think it's called RGB Fusion 2.0, well, that's the current version anyway. There's a carrying handle at the top of the stand there, and there's a cable tidy loop towards the bottom. The ports of the monitor are down firing, so I've got the monitor in portrait orientation at the moment so I can show you them more clearly. There's an AC power input, which means the monitor has an internal power converter. There is a 3.5mm headphone jack, a 3.5mm microphone jack, two HDMI 2.0 ports, and they support HDR capability, and also 144Hz, up to 144Hz I should say, at the native 2560 by 1440 WQHD resolution. They also offer adaptive sync, specifically support for AMD FreeSync on compatible GPUs and systems. There's DisplayPort 1.2a, which supports adaptive sync, and that includes AMD FreeSync support on compatible GPUs and systems, and also support for NVIDIA G-Sync compatible mode on compatible systems. There is a USB 3 upstream port and two USB 3 downstream ports. There's also a Kensington lock slot just there, a security feature. And something I didn't show you at the rear, the monitor attaches using a proprietary bracket mechanism. If you pinch those areas there, you can take the included stand off, and there are 100 by 100mm VESA holes, so you can use an alternative mount if you prefer. I'm now running Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and I'm going to talk about the contrast performance of the monitor. This monitor, as I've mentioned, uses an IPS type panel, so the static contrast is not amazing. I mean, it's not amazing compared to some VA models, for example, but it's not too bad on this model as far as the panel type goes at all. The static contrast I recorded was around 1200 to 1. It was pretty similar to that even after the adjustments made to my test settings. So as far as the panel type goes, really quite decent. Of course, one thing that IPS type panels are known for, IPS glow, that does feature on this monitor. There's a moderate amount of it. I should mention that the camera does tend to exaggerate this quite a bit compared to what I see to my eye. You can see it towards the corners, particularly the bottom left corner on the video, and a bit towards the bottom right as well, depending on the content. It sort of blooms out a bit more on the video than I can notice to my eye in this particular environment, my room lighting. But either way, it's definitely there. There's a moderate amount of it, and does eat away at some detail in those regions, and it sort of saps away at the atmosphere. This game title does have a lot of dark scenes such as this, where strong contrast performance certainly enhances the experience. And I wouldn't say this model delivers a particularly atmospheric sort of experience on scenes such as this. But still, the brighter elements there, the fire there, does stand out nicely compared to the darker background. And a nice thing about IPS type panels like this is they have very good gamma consistency, and the gamma tracking is very close to 2.2. Centrally, certainly was on my unit as I've got it set up at the moment. So that means that subtle details such as the brickwork there, it's pretty even throughout the screen, a bit less at the regions covered by the IPS glow as I mentioned before, but certainly for the central bulk of the screen it's good. And it doesn't have this issue with TN models where if you observe higher up the screen you get obvious crushing of dark details. Everything just looks crushed together, too dark, because the perceived gamma is far too high, so you lose a lot of this detail, whereas lower down things look really quite washed out and there's far too much detail, and that can even lead to what some people describe as banding, or sort of little artifacts on the image, things that should really be quite well masked by the screen sort of come out. So this model doesn't have any of those issues, but it does have the IPS glow. As I mentioned, the screen surface, it's nice and smooth and light matte anti-glare, so it doesn't have any obnoxious graininess, just a slight amount of graininess if you've got a keen eye for that kind of thing, so most users would find this just fine. I'm now going to talk about the colour reproduction of the monitor, and as usual I like to start this section off by looking at Lagom, that's lagom.nl, the website, because this has really nice tests for showing weaknesses or strengths in colour consistency. Being an IPS type panel, the expectation is that performance in this area is good, and indeed it is on this model. So the text test looks a blended grey throughout. There isn't really any obvious hints of green or red to the striping of the text. So on a TN model, you'd get an obvious gradient shift between sort of green, orange and red, depending on which area of the screen you're looking at, and that's from a normal viewing position. And if you move your head, there'd be some obvious shifts. VA models as well, they kind of have a central cone where it's more blended, and then around that there might be more pronounced saturation. So this model is far more consistent in terms of its gamma handling and in terms of its viewing angle performance. So the purple block here, that looks a bluish purple throughout. It has a bit of a pink hue, but that's pretty consistent throughout the screen really. There aren't any regions which have a much stronger pink hue than others. The red block, this appears a good solid red throughout. Again, there aren't really any issues with some areas looking more saturated and some less saturated and some more sort of pinkish burnt red. The kind of things you might observe on non-IPS type panels, or even some weaker IPS type panels. So there aren't any issues there. If you move your head slightly, things remain nice and consistent. There is a video looking at viewing angle performance from sharper viewing angles, and even IPS type models do have some weaknesses there. So if you're sort of looking at extreme angles, yes, there are shifts, certainly contrast shifts and perceived saturation shifts there. But from sort of a normal range of viewing position with a bit of head movement, no real issues there. The green block is a nice solid green throughout, a nice vibrant green. It's actually less of a yellow green than many monitors would display, and that's because the colour gamut is rather generous on this model. And there aren't any regions that concern me in terms of being sort of extra yellow in their hue. And again, that's much stronger than what you'd see on non-IPS type panels. The blue block, as usual, pretty consistent blue. You can get some sort of non-uniformity here based on backlight uniformity issues, and that does vary between individual units, so some units of this model may have that. I'm now on Battlefield 5, so I can show you some in-game examples of colour reproduction and talk about that. I like this particular scene and also other scenes set in this location on the game because there are some really nice vibrant shades which highlight monitors with strong vibrancy potential very nicely. And this model certainly does offer a vibrant and varied output for the colours, and that's partly because the colour gamut offers generous extension beyond sRGB. So that means that for content like this and your typical games, anything really that's SDR content, it's designed with the sRGB colour space in mind typically, and this is far more restrictive than the gamut that this model has. And that means that when you're viewing this sRGB style content, if you like, it's mapped onto a much larger gamut, and essentially the saturation levels are higher and things look more vibrant as a result. But because everything remains nicely spaced out on the gamut, it isn't compressed together, it's very different to the kind of look you'd get if you were to increase saturation digitally, for example, using NVIDIA Digital Vibrance. So all that does is that pulls shades close to the edge of the gamut without expanding the gamut itself. So your most saturated shades are actually determined at the edge of the gamut, and that's not expanded. You're not technically getting any extra saturation for the most extremely saturated shades, but what you're getting is shades that are less saturated are made more saturated, they're pulled close to the edge of the gamut, and it kind of just crushes things together. On this model, the gamut's expanded, so the most saturated shades are even more saturated, and the less saturated shades maintain their distance from these most saturated shades. So you maintain that variety. It doesn't have the look either that traditional wide gamut displays have with Adobe RGB gamuts, and they tend to have massive extension in the green region of the gamut, but in the red and blue they correspond roughly to sRGB, or very closely to sRGB if they're very strictly following Adobe RGB. And this really does give a skew of the image, which this model fortunately doesn't have. This model actually offers 95% DCI-P3 colour gamut coverage, and that comes into play for HDR, which I'll discuss shortly. But for SDR content like this, really nice, vibrant look. There's a lot of nice, rich reds, but there's also lots of autumnal orangey hues and orangey browns, and a nice palette of mixed greens and golden browns. And as I've mentioned, that the shade variety is maintained, it's not all crushed together, so that's really nice. Some users really like this kind of look, and it's a look that people have become accustomed to with smartphones even having quite a generous colour gamut these days, laptops, other devices like that as well. So it's sort of a look that people kind of come to expect, and it looks very far from washed out, but it doesn't look cartoonish in my opinion either. The sky as well, nicely saturated. I mean, if you're going to be critical, and of course some users do prefer things to look sort of more natural in their saturation and more accurate, more as the developers intended, then yes, there are some elements which are clearly more saturated than they should be. So the sort of woody hues here, they've got too much of a red hue, and you get this with some patches of earth and other areas of this game and other games. They tend to sort of have more of a red hue than they should, rather than a more neutral brown colour. And some of the greens as well, they look kind of a bit sort of bright and saturated. They should look a bit more muted, a bit duller. But again, some people like this look, others don't. Personal preference, really. I'm now running the game in HDR, high dynamic range, and I'm going to talk about the HDR performance of the monitor. This monitor is VESA HDR 400 compliant, and that's actually the lowest level of VESA certification that VESA will certify for. I have to say, I'm not going to spend too long going through this section. I will give you some more examples on other games as well, specifically Shadow of the Tomb Raider, but I'm not massively impressed with the HDR performance of this monitor. I mean, I didn't expect miracles. VESA HDR 400 is not really going to be a true HDR experience by any stretch of the imagination, but I do know from this model, and what I've said already you should know, that the colour gamut, 95% DCI-P3, that actually extends far beyond the standard required for VESA HDR 400. So in that respect, this monitor does tick a big box. However, the way it's been implemented here, I don't really like it. It basically just looks quite dull. Again, this might not come out on the video. It certainly looks less saturated than without HDR, and it should, and certainly some elements should, but there's really some obvious lack of vibrancy in places. Now, one thing about the HDR on this model, which is a little bit curious, is you have full capability to change all of your settings, like gamma and various other things, gamma, brightness as well. So I've got my test setting brightness set to 23, far too dull for HDR. Really, if you want anything approaching a kind of real HDR experience for the bright shades, you're really looking at a brightness level of 100. But when you do that, things still just look sort of dull. Now, if you change the gamma setting to gamma 4, it sort of makes things look far too deep. It does get rid of some of the dulling, it sort of increases saturation and depth, but it just goes too far and things just look quite wrong. On the plus side, some of the saturation I mentioned before, some of the overdone saturation, for example, the woody hues there, sort of earthy brown hues as well, and the green of the bush there, it kind of has more of a neutral hue. It doesn't have that kind of reddish push, and it actually has quite a nice rich earthy brown quality. And the green there, it has a good kind of slightly golden but quite deep and natural looking green hue, rather than looking sort of overdone yellow. So in that respect, that's quite good, but really the sort of most saturated shades should pop more than they do, and this is under HDR. The reason for that is that it's the DCI-P3 colour gamut that's targeted for HDR content like this, so it's more appropriately in line with the actual gamut of this monitor, and that can mean that, so that means that the sort of extra saturation can be toned down where the developers want it. But the developers, when they're producing HDR content like this, they also want some vibrant elements, and really the sort of lush red hues there aren't as vibrant as they should be at all. And although there aren't any particular examples here, flames on this game as well, they just don't have that kind of vibrant quality they should, and it just doesn't sort of stand out in the way it should. So in many respects, the colour reproduction is sort of a bit of a miss, really. It has good capability for HDR in terms of the colour gamut, but it just isn't really put to very good use. Note that these observations are using an NVIDIA GTX 1080 Ti. I'm now on another scene, and this particular scene I've used when I've looked at various other HDR models, even VESA Display HDR 400 models. And I like this because it really sort of highlights some of the more saturated shades I was talking about. So the fire here, for example, the red hues aren't really quite as strong as they could be. It does have some fairly saturated and vibrant looking oranges, although they have a bit sort of too much yellow to them, so they don't really stand out as they should. The sort of autumnal colours as well, some of them just look too flat. I think the reds are really just sort of a bit too subdued, and some of the rich oranges as well aren't really quite as saturated as they should be. And things just look a bit flat overall, and part of that could be not just the colour gamut, but the contrast performance of this monitor and how it's implemented under HDR is not particularly great, and I'm going to come on to that using Shadow of the Tomb Raider as an example. I should mention that I am actually using an NVIDIA GTX 1080 Ti as I'm recording this section of the video, and I've also tested this on a Radeon RX 580, and I noticed some differences, and I will go through them towards the end of this section of the video. I'm now running Shadow of the Tomb Raider under HDR. I'm going to talk about the contrast performance primarily and how that applies under HDR. I'm also going to talk a little bit more about colour reproduction and related elements. So again, I wouldn't say things look exactly washed out in terms of the colour reproduction. I mean, there are some fairly saturated green shades here. They look quite decent, but they just sort of lack something. They look a little bit flat and they just lack a bit of intensity, even though the brightness of the monitor is on maximum. Lara's skin, that looks nice and neutral, and that's something which is a bit better under HDR, certainly. Her skin tone looks too red. I wouldn't really say sunburnt, but a bit too tanned under SDR on this monitor. But under HDR, that's sort of corrected, so that looks more appropriately saturated. Another key aspect of HDR is 10-bit colour reproduction. So this brings extra precision to the tone mapping. This monitor, and indeed the HDR pipeline, does support 10-bit, and I will say that the light streaming out of there, for example, it has a nice smooth gradient. It won't come across in the video, it'll just look like a big ball of light, but there are some good nuances there. But it doesn't really have the sort of intensity it should under HDR, and there isn't that contrast that there should be between these bright elements and the darker surroundings. Part of this is because this monitor doesn't have any local dimming, so your ideal HDR display would be able to show really intense bright shades there and much deeper darker shades on the screen at the same time. So that would make this scene look a lot more dynamic and a lot higher in the contrast than is shown here. This model, things kind of just look quite a bit flooded really, quite bright but not super bright, and the elements there don't stand out really as they should. Another thing I've noticed is the shadow detailing. That's something which HDR displays, even VESA display HDR 400 displays, can be really impressive at showing. For example, the AOC AG273QCX, which I reviewed recently, also the Acer XP273K, which I reviewed recently. Now, the Acer does have very low level of local dimming, but this doesn't really help with what I'm talking about here. So if you look at the greenery here, for example, there should be a much deeper look to the shadow details and the dark areas there than there is on this model. Things just look quite flat, as I mentioned before. And the same here, things just kind of look flat, they don't look dynamic at all. The light shining off the leaf there should be much brighter than it is, and the dark shadowy details should be much darker. Now of course, I have got it running at full brightness now, and it does improve a bit in terms of the depth naturally if I reduce the backlight brightness, as you might expect. But things now just look really dull and not dynamic at all still. So that's kind of improved the shadow depth. But there still is a lack of nuanced shade variety, and that's because the tone mapping doesn't seem to be very good. The HDR implementation of this monitor is not really great in that respect, and that's something which was much better on the models I mentioned before, which are, again, VESA HDR 400 compatible, but this monitor just doesn't really tick the box of appropriate tone mapping in my view. It doesn't matter what refresh rate or what color signal you're using either. I've tested various, I'm running at 144 Hz at the moment, but I've tested this in depth using 120 Hz, 60 Hz, various different color signals in the control panel as well, and in the graphics driver, and it doesn't really deliver anything approaching a proper HDR experience. Some users may still like the look under HDR on this monitor, and that's fair enough. Really, I would say the HDR capability on this monitor is severely lacking overall. Now on Battlefield 5 again, and as promised, I am just going to show you quite briefly HDR running on my AMD GPU, my AMD Radeon RX 580. Immediately I noticed that the colours are quite different. There's still lots of muted shades. These earthy browns here have the reddish hue toned down compared to running the game in SDR, so that's good. Those shades are supposed to look more muted, and indeed they do. The green there as well looks fairly muted. It looks quite rich, but it doesn't have the kind of yellow cast it has under SDR. But there are some really nice, vibrant, reddish, orangey brown shades where they're intended. So the leaves here, for example, these autumnal colours stand out a lot more pleasantly than they do on the NVIDIA GPU under HDR. This paint there as well, the green paint, is really vibrant, and so is the red paint. And also explosions. You don't see too many of them on this particular scene, but explosions and fire in general on this game are much more pleasant. They stand out much more clearly. So essentially, it looks more muted where it should look more muted, and it looks more vibrant where it should look more vibrant. So this is really how things should look in the colour department under HDR. I'm now on Shadow of the Tomb Raider again, and I'm running my AMD GPU. The game's running in HDR. I'm going to focus primarily on contrast. But again, I do notice that the colours are more vibrant now. These greens stand out in a nicer way, and it still looks natural in terms of the shades that should appear more muted, looking more muted, such as Lara's skin tone. She has quite a nice neutral quality to that, so that is an improvement compared to SDR. In terms of the tone mapping, it's fairly similar to what I saw on my NVIDIA GPU. There are some slight improvements though. In terms of the shadow detailing, this particular scene doesn't really show the improvements particularly well. The shadow detailing is a bit better, but certainly the contrast and the backlight control and all of that is actually very much the same as on my NVIDIA GPU. And that was really my key disappointment. Aside from the colours, which is improved on the AMD GPU under HDR, it was really the contrast or the lack thereof that was my main criticism, and this remains here. So the bright shades here, they look nice and bright, but I've got the monitor set to a brightness of 100, whereas the darker shades here look a bit kind of flooded really. They just don't have the depth they should, and for that reason it doesn't have the kind of contrast you should expect under HDR. And again, you can reduce the brightness manually, but then all you get is these brighter shades appearing too muted, and the deeper shades do look a bit deeper, but really the tone mapping and contrast combined doesn't give the kind of distinct look to those dark areas that you should have under HDR. And I'd say even on my AMD GPU, where there's an improvement compared to my NVIDIA GPU under HDR, things aren't really as good as I've seen even on some VESA Display HDR 400 level displays. So certainly could have been some improvements there. HDR on this monitor, really I see it as a sort of perhaps a bonus feature. It might be nice to have a bit of a play with, and some users will like the kind of look it gives to games, but in my view it really isn't a particularly good HDR implementation. Now on Battlefield 5 again, I'm going to talk about the responsiveness of the monitor. There's an article on the website that looks at the key concepts related to monitor responsiveness, definitely worth a read, but if you're shorter on time, the written review has a nice summary of these key concepts related to monitor responsiveness. And one of the key concepts is perceived blur. And this is actually caused primarily by eye movement as you track motion on the monitor. And it's something that's closely linked to the refresh rate. So pixel responsiveness, that's the other aspect of perceived blur. That doesn't actually affect the perceived blur due to eye movement. So you could have really, really fast pixel responses, but you're always going to get this sort of mask of perceived blur related to the frame rate of the content and the refresh rate of the display. So I'm running this content at the moment at 144 frames a second. I've got the monitor set to 144 Hz, and that means that I'm getting the most out of the monitor. If my frame rate drops, as I'll look at shortly, this does increase the perceived blur due to eye movement. It also changes what I call the connected feel. So at this lovely high frame rate and this high refresh rate, it has a really nice connected feel as I'm interacting with the game world. It feels really fluid. There's a certain flow to it which is lacking at lower refresh rates and lower frame rates. And this is something which you really have to feel to appreciate, and it's separate to input lag, although input lag does affect the connected feel. And this monitor has a low level of input lag. I measured somewhere around 3 milliseconds, so that isn't going to bother even sensitive users, the input lag on this monitor. And coupled with the high frame rate, high refresh rate experience, really nice connected feel. So it certainly ticks that box. In terms of pixel responses, overall they're fast enough for really good 144 Hz, 144 frames a second performance, but there are some weaknesses. So some of the pixel responses are a bit slower than optimal. You can see that a bit on this dark area there against the quite light, sort of medium to light shades in the background. There's a little bit of what I call powdery trailing, but it's only a light powdery trailing. It's not like the kind of smearing you'd get on some VA models, and actually typically you'd get on VA models for these kind of high contrast transitions. There is a clearer example here. So actually the slowest transitions on this model occur where there are very light shades, such as white here, for where it says E to pick up a letter, against a significantly darker background. It doesn't have to be significantly darker, but that sort of helps it stand out anyway. The kind of contrast naturally makes it quite clear that there's a powdery trailing there. And I describe it as a heavy powdery trailing. Some people might describe it as slightly smeary in its appearance, this particular trailing, but it's not really too bad, and certainly, as I said, compared to VA models, not bad at all. And you get it a bit around these pots here as well. There's just a kind of light powdery trail behind the pot. It sticks quite close to the object itself. It doesn't extend out, and that's why I wouldn't call it smeary in its appearance, but it does add a bit to perceived blur. But most of the transitions don't really show this. There is, however, a fair degree of overshoot. I'm using the fastest pixel response setting on this monitor, called speed, and that's my preferred setting at high refresh rates. So there is a bit of overshoot, inverse ghosting. You can see that around the tree here, or I can to my eye. There's a little bit of a halo trailing, so it's kind of brighter than the background colour and certainly brighter than the object colour, and it has a slight sort of blue tint to it, just around the flag post there and the tree. It might not come out on the video. It's not a massive amount in this particular example. I will show you some clearer examples of overshoot shortly. This scene isn't actually that good for showing overshoot. There's also a little bit of dark trailing or dirty trailing, whatever you want to call it. Again, overshoot, but that is darker than the foreground or background colour, so it sort of stands out for that reason. But it's actually quite faint, just around the light there. That particular overshoot is not really particularly obvious. I'm now on a scene which will show the overshoot more clearly, and that's because there are some brighter shades and sort of medium shades rather than predominantly darker shades, and this is where the overshoot tends to be more obvious. So if you look at the building edge there, for example, there's a sort of bright halo trailing which stands out quite readily. And there's probably some better examples a bit further in actually. If you look at the buildings down there, again you can see, or I can certainly see, a bright halo trailing. And this is actually something I found a bit distracting on this model. It doesn't distract everyone. Sensitivity to overshoot varies, but certainly when I was playing this on multiplayer, I did really find this quite eye-catching. I did notice the overshoot, and it was quite apparent on lots of different scenes in multiplayer as well. You can actually see, if you look there, you can actually see some dark trailing, some of that dirty trailing I was talking about, as well as bright trailing, depending on which direction you're moving the mouse and which aspect you're looking at. You can see some bright flashes as well. And this is actually quite strong overshoot, these examples, and I did notice them quite readily on this game and other games using the speed setting. Again, they don't bother everyone, just a bit high for my personal taste. However, the alternative to this would be to use the balance overdrive setting, which is considerably weaker. And this actually gets rid of that overshoot. And this won't be clear in the video. You might be able to see that there's not overshoot there, but there is actually quite a bit of powdery trailing, and it actually has a bit of a smeary quality. The sort of dark transitions, or dark to sort of medium transitions around here, there's a definite smear that wasn't there before. The same around the dark concrete areas there. And this does add significantly to the perceived blur. So for that reason, I don't really like using this setting. It doesn't make good use of the 144 Hz refresh rate of the monitor. And I would tolerate, although I don't love it, I would tolerate the overshoot in preference to this. So I'm going to set it back to my preferred speed setting. You will notice there was another overdrive setting, picture quality, but that is really a very weak level of overdrive, and it doesn't deliver a very nice experience at all, even at much lower refresh rates than this, 144 Hz. So there's the overshoot, it's back, and it's not wonderful if you are sensitive to this kind of thing. I know some people really hate overshoot, and I mean, I consider myself moderately tolerant to it, but I feel it's a bit too high, even for my taste on this model. And it's higher than on the Dell S2719DGF, for example, and it's even higher than on the Dell S2716DG, which I use as one of my main gaming monitors. And that's a sort of older revision of it. It's not one of the most recent revisions, so it's one of the ones that has quite strong overshoot, but I found the overshoot on this more noticeable than that. And it's not just these sort of extreme, if you like, examples of overshoots, the sort of bright trailing. There's actually kind of a frequent over sharpening effect, and you notice that just around the window panes here, or I notice it to my eye, and it kind of just makes the textures look a bit artificial and overly sharpened when you move. It's not a natural look to the image, but again, it doesn't bother everyone. And I'm not trying to say this monitor's poor in terms of the responsiveness. Overall, I think most users are going to find it just fine, but I do like to nitpick. I mean, anyone who has listened to my reviews before or read my reviews will know this, so I just like to point these things out. I'm now on a different scene on Battlefield 5, and again you can see some examples of overshoot around the trees here. I can see examples of bright trailing, halo trailing, but actually I'm not really going to talk about that too much. But really the key purpose of me showing you this section is actually to talk about another capability of this monitor, and that is adaptive sync. And that means that it supports AMD FreeSync on compatible AMD GPUs and systems, and it can also be used with NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode on compatible NVIDIA GPUs. So that's GTX 10 series and newer, using Windows 10 as an operating system at the moment. So what this means is the monitor adjusts its refresh rate to match the frame rate of the content. So you might not be able to see it very clearly on the video, but towards the top right, there's a frame rate display, actually a refresh rate display on the game. And this corresponds to the refresh rate of the monitor, as I'm running this with NVIDIA G-Sync compatible mode at the moment. I've got a GTX 1080 Ti. Overall, the experience on the NVIDIA and AMD GPU I tested, very similar in this respect. There's some slight differences, which I'll come on to shortly, but overall it was very good in terms of the ability to get rid of tearing and stuttering from frame rate and refresh rate mismatches. And that's because it's matching them up and they don't go out of sync in the same way. Whereas if you have the technology disabled, you'd see obvious stuttering if you had VSync enabled, or you'd see obvious tearing if you had VSync disabled and also had this technology disabled. So it's something which users like me who are sensitive to tearing and stuttering, it's really nice to have this removed. It gives a much nicer flow to the experience, a lot less distracting, sort of from a competitive point of view even. It's something I rather like having. And just to the eye really, in terms of the visual look to the game, it just keeps things looking more natural, and I much prefer that. Not everyone is as sensitive to this, but it is something I notice even with slight drops in frame rate if I had the technology disabled. But there are some frequent drops below 144 Hz, so it's nice to have this technology in scenes like this. And on this game, more broadly, especially when you're playing multiplayer, there are almost always going to be some little times when the frame rate drops, so it is nice to have this as a backup. I've now increased the graphics settings considerably, so I have a lower frame rate. It's sort of around 100 frames a second. It does fluctuate a bit around there. And what I notice is, again, the tearing and stuttering from frame rate and refresh rate mismatches are completely absent, so adaptive sync's doing its thing. That's very nice. But I also notice that the connected feel isn't quite as good. When I move the mouse, I'm interacting with the game world, and the perceived blur due to eye movement is increased. And that's just related to the frame rate. That isn't something which adaptive sync, whether it's AMD FreeSync or NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode, can actually counteract. Another aspect is that the overshoot, which I mentioned before, is now considerably stronger. There are some strong examples of overshoot on this model, even at 144 Hz, or even with slight dips below that. but at 100 Hertz, it really does ramp things up a bit. And this is related to the refresh rate rather than just the frame rate. So if you disable the technology and your frame rate dips, it just acts as if it's at 144 Hertz in terms of the pixel response behavior. This is something which G-Sync models, and this is actual G-Sync models, handle a lot better. They have something called variable overdrive, and that means it slackens off the pixel overdrive as the refresh rate dips, as should happen, because you don't need this kind of level of voltage surge for the overdrive, and it just causes extreme overshoot at these lower frame rates and refresh rates. So you might be able to see a particularly nice example of that around the tree there, a nice bright trail. I do hope this comes out on the video because it's sometimes difficult to capture this on a video, but to my eye that's really bright and rather extreme overshoot. Increase the graphics settings further by bumping up the resolution scale, so the rendering resolution's been increased considerably now, and you'll see my frame rate. I'm not sure if you can see that in the video, but it's sort of around 60 frames a second, which is when it's green, but it does dip a little bit below that, which is when it goes yellow, or considerably below that at times when it goes red. And again, Adaptive Sync's doing its thing, but one thing to note, I did mention there's a difference between the NVIDIA G-Sync compatible mode and the AMD FreeSync implementation. FreeSync will allow the monitor to go as low as 48 Hertz, so if you've got as low as 48 frames a second, and it will match the frame rate with its refresh rate. On NVIDIA systems, the floor of operation is 60 Hertz. It certainly was on my graphics card and the graphics driver I was using anyway. And this doesn't really have a huge impact on the experience, because whether you're using an AMD GPU or an NVIDIA GPU with this technology, it uses LFC, low frame rate compensation, for AMD side, or similar technology on the NVIDIA side. And this means that it will use a multiple of the frame rate with its refresh rate to keep tearing and stuttering at bay. So when you see that go red and it's well below 60 frames a second, the monitor can't go at that sort of refresh rate on my NVIDIA GPU. It just doesn't support that, but it will keep to a multiple of that. To make this a bit clearer, I'll turn on the refresh rate display that's integrated into the monitor. The displayed number there fluctuates a lot. It reacts very quickly to changes in refresh rate, so it's a bit difficult to read, but you can see it's actually double what the frame rate is showing a lot of the time. So that's the technology in action. And again, it works just fine to get rid of tearing and stuttering. I don't actually notice any particular disadvantage to this, and actually the overshoot levels are reduced. If you recall, I mentioned they're tied to the refresh rate rather than the frame rate. So if you're having it at sort of 90 Hertz, it's actually better than having your monitor set to below 50 Hertz in terms of the overshoot levels. Just to reinforce this point, I've dialed the graphics settings back just a little bit, and now I'm getting sort of close to 70 frames a second, and you can see that the monitor is running at around 70 Hertz. There is fluctuation either side, but this does give extreme overshoot. I will use the word extreme in this case because the bright trailing really does stand out around those trees there very nicely indeed. And I don't say nicely as a nice thing. So I would say that if you are frequently dipping this low, this overshoot really does get unsightly, and some users will actually find it unbearable at this level. So I would actually recommend that you dial back the overdrive setting. Set that to balance instead. That will greatly reduce this overshoot. And as I mentioned before, there are some weaknesses in terms of slower than optimal pixel transitions, but they're not actually as important at the reduced. But at these reduced refresh rates and frame rates, they're not so important. The requirements for pixel responses aren't as tight, and the monitor actually does a decent job with its balance setting at these kind of frame rates and refresh rates. It's difficult to give an exact figure. There are still some transitions where there are weaknesses even at 60 Hertz or so with this setting, but I think most people would find that they stand out less than the overshoot. The problem is when you're playing games that are very dynamic in their nature and you have a huge range of refresh rates, it'll be difficult to decide which setting you want to use. So there's really no hard and fast rules in that respect, and it would have been nicer if there was a better balance as you get on NVIDIA G-Sync displays with their variable overdrive, so the monitor sorting itself out rather than you having to set the setting yourself based on the frame rate. So to wrap up then, this monitor goes head to head with a lot of models which use a slightly different panel, an IPS type panel, but rather than it being an Innolux panel like this, it's one of the AU Optronics AHVA panels. And there were some slight differences in the performance, mainly in terms of the colour reproduction. The colour gamut of this model is more generous than the competing models, and that gives a more vibrant look to the image, but it's done in a way that retains shade variety rather than sort of like a digital saturation enhancement. So this will appeal to some users will like this look. Others might prefer the more muted tones of the alternative models, or using the sRGB emulation mode on this model. The sRGB emulation mode isn't perfect on this model in terms of the fact that you've got a fixed brightness, you can't adjust the backlight brightness, and also you can't adjust the color channels. So they could have offered better flexibility in the OSD when using the sRGB emulation mode. But in terms of the color gamut restriction, it does work quite well. The overall output was also consistent, and in that respect, it was very much like an IPS type panel. It delivered nice levels of saturation across the screen, a nice vibrant look throughout the screen, and it also delivered a nice variety of shades. And the consistency helps with that, because a shade that you view in the center of the screen looks largely the same as that same shade displayed further out. On TN models of VA, that sort of shade viewed further out, even from a normal viewing position, the weaknesses in terms of the viewing angle and perceived gamma changes would mean that that shade might be displayed with much greater or much weaker saturation, depending on where it's displayed on the screen. I also found the screen surface very agreeable. A good light matte screen surface without an obvious grainy texture to it, so that was nice. The contrast performance was about as good as I've seen actually from an IPS type panel. The static contrast around 1200 to 1, even after adjustments made to my test settings. There was a moderate amount of IPS glow, and I suppose you could argue that some models are better in this respect because they have so-called low glow panels, but actually the competing models to this certainly don't have low glow panels. They too have a moderate amount of IPS glow. Backlight bleed is something which varies between individual units, so there's not much point in me sort of going through that too much. There's a little section on that in the written review if you're interested in that kind of thing, but essentially that can accentuate IPS glow as well. It can sort of bring it out more if you've got issues with clouding or backlight bleed. It can sort of accentuate the IPS glow. But on my model, there were no extreme issues in either regard really, so it actually gave a rather decent contrast performance. The design of the monitor as well, worth mentioning that. It has the kind of look that is found on many recent Acer Predator models. It's quite angular. Certainly the stand base, for example, has quite an angular look to it. And it has the usual sort of dual stage bezel design with three-sided borderless. I don't really have any major complaints about the design. I'm not the most fussy person in terms of monitor design though, so perhaps I'm not the best person to really give an opinion of that. But one thing that does bother me on some models is when they have a really deep stand base and you can't put the monitor particularly close to the wall. This model does have a moderately deep stand base, so I couldn't push it as close to the wall as I would have liked, but it isn't as deep as some models. It's not ridiculous. Like some Samsung models in particular, they have that reticulated arm design, which extends massively far back from the monitor itself. That's a real pain. This model also had an RGB lighting feature. I didn't find that particularly useful because it doesn't actually do anything if you're sitting in front of the monitor. Even in a dark room, it doesn't create a halo of light or bias light around the monitor. It's only really there to admire if you can see the back of the monitor. And in my room, you can't. The wall is looking at the back of the monitor, so it really had very little utility for me. But if you've got your monitor somewhere where you can admire the back of it, or other people in your household can admire the back of it, or you've had a LAN party or something like that, then sure, it's a neat feature, I suppose. The HDR performance of the monitor, I'm not really going to spend too much time going through that because it wasn't really particularly impressive. Even by VESA Display HDR 400 standards, I've certainly seen some better implementations in terms of the tone mapping capabilities. It doesn't offer any local dimming on the backlight, and that is one issue, but the tone mapping as well, the way it's implemented, the level of flexibility you get in the OSD, these are all problematic and not really what you'd expect from a true HDR experience. And the colour gamut, as I mentioned, it's nice and wide. It's actually 95% DCI-P3. That corresponds very closely to the target for a good HDR experience, but the way it was implemented meant that some of the more vibrant shades were sort of lacking a bit, and it doesn't really have that sort of vivacity that you'd expect from HDR. Of course, the other key aspect of performance, the responsiveness of the monitor, very important with a model like this. Nice headline feature being 144Hz, support for adaptive sync, which includes AMD FreeSync. And overall, it put in a good 144Hz performance, snappy pixel responses, low input lag. There were some weaknesses, slight issues with some slower than optimal pixel responses, but really the bigger issue I had was with the overshoot. If you're using the optimal setting for the higher refresh rates, or what I consider to be optimal, the speed setting, the overshoot levels are quite high, and higher than you'd find on, for example, the Dell S2719DGF. Adaptive sync, as I'd mentioned, works just fine on both AMD and NVIDIA GPUs. The technology worked to get rid of tearing and stuttering, but as the frame rate decreased, that overshoot I mentioned became really quite extreme. So I have to draw comparisons with the responsiveness. The Dell S2716DG, which I use as one of my main gaming monitors, doesn't have as much overshoot as this, but it is known to have quite a high level of overshoot. So this was more obvious than the Dell in terms of overshoots, and that's really not a very good sort of baseline to be working from. There were some weaknesses in terms of slower than optimal pixel responses, but they were sort of secondary to the overshoot in my opinion. The overshoot as well, it's much stronger than on the competing AHVA models, and they don't really have any extra weaknesses in terms of pixel responses. The actual speed of the pixel responses is very similar. It's just that you get a high level of overshoot on this. So I can't really sort of wholeheartedly recommend this, but if you really are interested in vibrant color output and color is really your main focus, and you're less interested in excellent responsiveness or anything like that, but still want decent responsiveness, then I guess this model can deliver what you'd be after. And I think at any rate, this is certainly a decent first entry for Gigabyte AORUS into the monitor market. It's the first ever monitor they've made, and it's really not a bad product. So that's really all there is to the Gigabyte AORUS AD27QD. Be sure to check out the full review on pcmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do.